please come on in. We're going to have a very unusual and distinctively different program featuring both General William Sherman and President Abraham Lincoln. First time together on the stage, and we're more than honored to have everybody assembled here. Becky and I will do our best to lead a conversation about what was in their pockets in terms of money, tokens, spare change, foldable bills, everything. Very different world than what we live in today. And we'll have to do a little extra tutorial as we go along in case the general and the president may not be familiar with each and every piece of paper or coin that may have been in their wallet. So this is an unusual take on numismatics. It gives a distinctively different approach to understanding the money that helped make the Civil War viable. I mean, people had to come up with all kinds of ways to produce money and to create tokens, to create things of value when there were great shortages of U.S. minted money. It's always worth also mentioning that everyone says money is hoarded during the Civil War. That is true. But the other part of the story that rarely gets told is that we had 5 U.S. mints operating during the beginning of the Civil War. One was, of course, in Philadelphia, one was in San Francisco, and there was one in Dahlonega, in Georgia, Charlotte, North Carolina, and a big mint down in New Orleans. Now, when the war started, and the states seceded one by one, the states that seceded took every federal asset. That included the custom houses, the arsenals, and the mints. So we shut down effectively for the North 3 out of the 5 mints that were operating in 1860. 2 of them, Dahlonega and Charlotte, never opened again. New Orleans was shuttered in April of 1861, produced some beautiful coins. They would look like this actual 1861 half dollar. There was well over 1 million 1861 half dollars that were produced in New Orleans by the state of Louisiana, and then another 600 million coins that look just like this that were minted under the authority of the Confederate States of America until the day that they shut down the mint. So I bring that up to you because production in the U.S. mints was literally cut in half. And curiously enough, when you do your research about where dimes, and Bob brought up the importance of dimes as an everyday transaction, for some reason in Philadelphia, the minting of dimes went down to almost nothing during the Civil War, from a couple million down to 10, 20,000. And the emphasis on the production of dimes and half dimes went to the San Francisco Mint, because that's, of course, where the Comstock Lode was located out in Nevada. It was a lot easier to get the silver to San Francisco than it was to take the perilous trip to Philadelphia. Anyway, I bring all this up to you because we want to talk to you about the money that these gentlemen have had in their hands. And the General Sherman, just before the war broke out, was in New Orleans. It was rather a foreign territory for him because as secession drew very close, the general was running a small military academy, and he was buffeted by a lot of the political pressures at the time. Most of his friends at the academy all went to fight for the Confederacy, and it's important to point out that the general, I also wish to call him, if he does not mind, Uncle Billy, what happened to him was he had to draw the line as to how faithful he could be to this state appointment that he had down in Louisiana. And he did have to write a letter to the governor of the state of Louisiana, who had hired him to run this academy, to say it was no longer tenable for him to be able to stay in Louisiana. And it's my understanding that once he packed his bags and went back north, he joined his brother John for a short tour along the area that we're from, in Hagerstown, close to Antietam. And they toured the area along the Potomac River, which was the dividing line between the North and South. And the general was able to assess what he thought would be the best way to defend the North now that the state of Virginia had seceded. Now, going back to coins, it's really important to understand all the pressures that were on these two gentlemen to pay for the war, to finance the war, and as they called it at the time, pay for the cruel exigencies of war. And that really is what prompted a lot of the huge changes that we have to this day. Now, I want to go back and echo to some things that Bob was talking about, and that will lead me down to the path of the kinds of coins that a young General Sherman would have had before he had to go to war. Let me get this poster, and we'll begin the discussion. And General, just chime in any time that you wish with your experience. The very large gold $50 piece, also called a slug, was in great abundance and for the banking community. I bring that up because the young Billy was a banker. He started, of course, he was out in California before he even became a state. But the bottom line is, once the state of California was made part of the Union in 1850, Billy decided to stay, and he resigned his commission, didn't he, for a short time?
I took a 6-month leave of absence. I took a 6-month leave of absence, and then when that was up, then I resigned from the Army.
All right. Anyway, it was very likely that when General Sherman was working for Lucas Turner and Company of San Francisco, he would have handled some of these $50 privately minted coins. The mint didn't open until 1854, and it produced only gold coins in that year. And they looked very much like all the gold coins that you see that Bob has depicted as being on the ship, the Central America. But it wasn't until 1855 that the mint in San Francisco produced its first silver coins. And again, as I mentioned before, by the time the war rolled around, 1861, far more silver coins were being produced in San Francisco than in Philadelphia. Now, on the second tier, this is where Uncle Billy ran into some hot water. He was invited to a lot of political events by the governor in New Orleans in 1860. And in his memoir, he wrote that he had dinner with people that identified themselves as being with the Knights of the Golden Circle. This is an actual coin that they produced right here. I do not have a real sample of such a coin. In his memoirs, the general said that he was ignorant of such an organization, but he was there at the dinner party and learned that these gentlemen were not only behind the Southern cause, but they were interested in the takeover of Nicaragua, and they were also interested in the annexation of Cuba, so that if slavery were to fail in Kansas and other areas that were coming into the Union, they would be able to have a golden circle of slavery states and countries that they were hoping to control. It did not happen. But that was an eye-opener for the general that the Knights of the Golden Circle even existed. I'm sorry.
I would say once I graduated from West Point, a lot of my postings were down south. And I liked being down south. I liked the people, I liked the climate, I liked the scenery. I really liked being down there. I got along really well with them. And, I didn't really have any problem with their way of life.
Well, you were very close to 2 or 3 of the men at the academy, and had some discussions with them, because a lot of the Southerners thought that we could have an amicable separation of the North and the South. General Sherman didn't quite see it that way. He thought that that was not in the cards.
My number one issue is preserve the Union at all costs, no matter what it takes. The other stuff doesn't matter very much to me.
Understood. Oh, and by the way, it's really important to point out that the general really, and much later, within the last 4 years to be exact, had been honored as being the grandfather, if you would, or founding father of Louisiana State University, because louder? Oh, okay. Yes, Louisiana State University grew out of that tiny academy.
Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy.
And the gentleman that you got along with, I've forgotten his name. It's in the book, but was it Boyd? Okay, yeah. He became the first president of Louisiana State University after the war. So it's really fascinating what an influence the general had down in the Deep South. Now, the next token right here is the Dix Token, and the general and I had the chance to talk about it this morning. I don't know if anybody here knows too much about it, but it directly ties into the state of Louisiana. John Dix was our Secretary of the Treasury under Buchanan. He was the last treasurer and Treasury Secretary, sorry. And he was a very staunch Northern supporter out of New York. And he was the only person that the Northern bankers would trust to make a desperately needed $5 million loan to the U.S. government right before the war. There was a big deficit. We had a Secretary of the Treasury that came out of Maryland. The banks refused to lend money because Maryland was considered to be too much of a southern state. So John Dix, for 2 months, ran the Treasury with an iron fist just before the president took office. And it's important to note that already in New Orleans, just before the state seceded, there was a lot of hubbub down in New Orleans, a lot of hubbub, and people were starting to also take down the U.S. flag. That pissed off John Dix to no end. He sent a telegram down to the military commandant in New Orleans at that time, and he basically said, if anybody attempts to tear down the American flag, shoot them on the spot. That's what his exact words were. And in the North, they made a token, and it's called the Dix Token. And it was very popular in the North. It didn't get a lot of circulation down in the South, but it's possible that the general might have had such a token in his pocket. The next coin is the one that we have right here, which we briefly discussed. All the Liberty seated coins that were created in New Orleans, the half dollar they continued to produce, as the state of Louisiana used the same dies and the silver bullion, and they kept the mint personnel, although there were a few gentlemen that refused to sign a letter of allegiance to the Confederacy, and they left New Orleans. The bottom line is the mint shut down in 1861, but President Jeff Davis of the South had a very special coin that was minted just for him and 3 other men. It was the only 4 Confederate half dollars created on a hand press at the New Orleans Mint before it shut down for good until 1879. But the bottom line is that coin, we've done a genealogy on the 4 coins, and there are all kinds of stories as to where they went after the war, and many people didn't even know they existed until 1879, when a coin dealer up in New York wrote to Jeff Davis at his home and said, I have a coin here that's been offered to me. Do you think that you actually owned it? And Jeff Davis said, it's very unlikely. Mine was confiscated by the Union Army when I was arrested in Irwinville, Georgia. But I did own such a coin. And I personally believe he felt it was a talisman that brought him good luck and good fortune. And it did really, he had it on his person at all times during the war. So it's a very interesting story. I believe one of them was given to the American Numismatic Society, if I'm correct. And the last one that went to auction of the 4 coins sold for $1.7 million, give or take a few pennies. So it's an extraordinary coin, basically the last coin that was hand-struck in New Orleans. I doubt that the general would have had one of the ones that was minted for the Southern elite at the time, but nonetheless, that's the story there. The next coin here, which is very hard to read unless you get right up close to it, it basically is a coin, a quarter, that had been shaved down on one side and was created into a dog tag. This particular one was on a soldier who perished in Gettysburg. We just wanted to make sure that such a coin was shown, and out of respect for the people who created some of the first dog tags before the military did so officially. The next one over here is a sutler coin, good only for the sutlers that were contracted with the U.S. Army in order to buy things that the quartermasters couldn't or wouldn't carry. That included playing cards and sometimes tobacco and a variety of other things. But of course, you could only spend the settler token with the settler that produced it. So it was a great way to guarantee for the settler that he or she would always have some business. Now, at the very bottom here, we have 2 3-cent pieces. And it's important to note that, yeah, we had a 3-cent piece that was called a fish scale. It was a very small coin, probably as small as the small $quarter gold coin that Bob discussed. And it petered out they stopped minting them in Philadelphia by 1865. And they started to mint a nickel 3-cent piece in the same year, 1865. And the story behind that, and the story behind the fact that we have a nickel at all, is a guy that I think you all know his name, Joe Wharton of the Wharton Business School fame, was the guy who actually took over a failed nickel mine in Pennsylvania in 1862. He had a lot of money behind him with his family. He didn't have to fight in the war. And he invested in Europe and with people who really knew how to smelt nickel. The problem wasn't mining it. The problem was creating nickel that was usable as a commodity. He spent a lot of dough. He created a big plant in New Jersey. His mine took off. He met with Hugh McCulloch at the Treasury Department in the late part of the war, and he convinced Hugh McCulloch to create a nickel made out of nickel for the first time in 1866, and to convert the 3-cent piece over to nickel. So Joe Wharton made a lot of dough doing that with the U.S. Treasury, went on to make money doing a lot of things, including founding the Bethlehem Steel Company. But nonetheless, I just thought everyone should know that Joe Wharton was really the father of the fact that we have nickel as a 3-cent piece and as a 5-cent piece at the end of the Civil War. So I have exhausted my big talk with the general at the moment, but we wanted to share some other pieces of currency which are not depicted on the general's poster. And just to give you an example of a few things that were floating around, this particular bill from the Confederate States of America has, I know that wouldn't be your favorite topic, but that has Lucy Pickens on it, one of the few women who ever appeared on currency. And it's interesting, the South had 2 women that they featured on their bills, both of whom were very influential and had money that they gave to the South. But the point of all this is that Lucy was the wife of the governor of South Carolina, and the governor himself was the one who initially shelled Fort Sumter. And when the general went through South Carolina, he was a little rough in places here and there on Charleston. Maybe, well, actually, it was Columbia, right? Yeah, that's where she lived. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's right. No, you're right. Columbia was hit pretty hard. But anyway, Lucy Pickens was a very, very interesting woman. Had a lot of connections to Russia, where she got most of her money that she gave to the South. Here you gentlemen, take a look at her. Now all the major railroads had money. This was the Macon and Brunswick Railroad down to Macon, Georgia. And eventually we're going to talk about, not today, but we're going to talk about the Georgia Railroad Banking Company, which was very influential for the South. All the little cities in the South had their own money. Here's a note, gentlemen, from the city of Mobile, Alabama. And 2 more, and again, I'll circulate all these things if you guys want to see them. Small, what? If I get them back, yeah, that'd be a good point. This is a fractional note worth 25 cents at the time, in nice shape. It's George Washington on it, probably printed by the American Banknote Company in New York. They printed all of our greenbacks. And this is a really curious little thing. You know, there's a lot of script going around at the time, but this is the only one I've ever held in my hand that was actually from a hotel in Massachusetts for 10 cents. It was Young's Hotel with a picture of a handsome young man named Young, and he was the proprietor of the hotel. Now, of course, you could only spend the money at the Young's hotel, but when you ran out of change, you could hand that out, and you were guaranteed to have people come back. Very popular with bars, by the way. They would hand out their own script, and you had to come back for a drink, no problem. So a few of the other things before I turn it over to Becky and to the president. Here's a sample, gentlemen, of the shield nickel, which is, of course, created through the wealth and influence of Joe Warden. And of course, Bob talked a lot about the importance of dimes. Here's a good example of a Liberty-seated dime. It's important to note that the only thing we had during the Civil War that was worth 5 cents was a half dime. No nickel. Very small. We have some samples here if you guys ever want to see them, but the half dime stuck around from 1792 until the basically the end of the Civil War, and that's when the nickel rolled in. And this is the very small, very tiny 3-cent piece, and it's the size of your fingernails. It must have been tough to handle that thing and not lose it. That's all of my show and tell for right now. Thank you, General, for being a part of all this so far. Yeah, you're welcome to chime in at any time.
The only thing that I would add at the moment is, if this is really scarce, when we marched through Georgia, when we captured the Confederate capital of Milledgeville, we actually burned most of the money that was in their treasury.
Oh, really?
And we had a like fake meeting with the governor, because he was gone. So we took his place for a little while.
Thank you very much. I'm a little louder. I'm Becky Rush, and we're going to do this just a little differently. First of all, I'd like to point your attention to a larger poster that we've used in the past, which was kind of all about what was in your purse or wallet during the Civil War. And I think you can see there that there were many, many different, I would never have wanted to have been a store clerk or a banker, because you're always challenged with making change for 2-cent pieces, 3-cent pieces, nickel. There wasn't the nickel yet, but half dimes and other kinds of things. Foreign currency was, minted money was being floated around as well. And I'd like to just share that, kind of leveraging what Bob Evans had shared with us about using money as kind of a way of expressing what was going on in a period of time, I think is particularly important. And what I'd like to point out on this poster is we have a picture of one of the tokens that represents President Lincoln during this extremely contentious election of 1860. We also, behind us is a poster that shows President Lincoln along with his contenders, the other 3 people. But bear in mind, people in many cases were not necessarily literate. And so if you had the image of somebody who was running for election, this might be a way of your being able to know better about who this person was. But indeed, what you see on the token about President Lincoln is there is no beard on this gentleman. So how did we go from 1860, no beard, to 1862, here's a 50-cent piece, it's a 50-cent printed money, and now you see a beard. And Mr. President, would you care to explain what you did to what happened that all of a sudden you have a beard?
Well, first of all, Mrs. Lincoln didn't like beards. She said it tickled her fancy. So I never grew a beard. But I was running for president, and I got a letter from a little girl who lived in Westfield, New York. Her name was Grace Bedell. Now, I cannot quote her letter verbatim, but it went something sort of like this. She says, Mr. Lincoln, my father just came back from the fair, and he brought a photo of you. And you'll forgive me for saying so, but your face is so long and your neck is so skinny. Now, the word ugly was nowhere in the letter. But she said that women, of course, women couldn't vote in those days, but women like whiskers. She said, if you will grow a beard, the wives will tease their husbands to vote for you. She said, if she was a boy and she could vote, if I would grow a beard, she'd vote for me. So I did write her back a letter and thanked her, and I said, but as far as the whiskers are concerned, having never grown facial hair, wouldn't that be a silly form of affection for whatever that meant? But on the way to D.C., we stopped in Westfield, New York. They brought Grace up to meet me. I picked her up and I kissed her right between the eyes, and I said, well, Grace, honey, what do you think of my new whiskers? She looked at me for a little while and she said, well, it's a handsome effort. But you need to understand, an 11-year-old girl changed the history of the United States forever, because no president before me, was no image of a president with facial hair. And after that, it got to be who could grow the biggest or ugliest beard. So I tell children today, if you want your president to do something, write him a letter.
Oh, now that's a lesson we can all learn from. And so on this poster again, you see a 50-cent piece of printed money. And this is part of the theme of no small change. People had hoarded. And as the president had discussed and Rick had discussed, this is an artifact from the Dahlonega Mint, which was operating down in Georgia, minting gold coins until, guess what? The Confederacy said, oh, it's in my territory. I'm taking your mint. And along with the mint, they took the operating systems, they took every reserve of gold that was there. And it's my contention that if President Lincoln had had an opportunity to carry with him something from that era, it would have been one of these gold coins to remember what that Confederacy did when they started taking things away. But Lincoln had been a banker, not a banker, but a state legislator. And one of the things that he had done in the legislation in Illinois, and this is an example of a state of Illinois bank note, and I believe, and I don't know if you want to comment on this, but I do believe that you chatted fairly openly in Congress about the need for keeping bank money, and yet not saying you disapproved of federal money. And this was also a very contentious issue during that period of time, because President Jackson had wanted to disavow a national bank. But it came to be that during the Civil War, we couldn't go on with just the coins that were there. We were spending a lot, and therefore, the 1862 Legal Tender Act, the presses got turned on. And here we have an example of now greenbacks, printed money. The next thing Mr. Lincoln did was say, oh, who is going to handle all this greenback money? It's printed in New York, it's coming down to Washington, D.C. on slabs of paper, and who's going to do this? We need all these men clerks to get out there and fight. So, do you remember what you did?
Well, of course I remember. The boys were out fighting the war, but the ladies were at home, and especially young girls. They had really fine fingers, and they could cut nice and straight, so they cut our bills for us. As a matter of fact, the women in America in the North played a large part in keeping the Union together. Now, they had the advantage over some of the ladies in the South who didn't have as many resources as they could call for, but if we hadn't had these ladies to help us with our currency and then start the sanitary fairs, well, we would have lost a lot more soldiers to disease than what we did.
I 100% agree. And in 1861, President Lincoln had issued a notice to the loyal women of America saying, get your act together, ladies. And if you have a sewing circle, if you have a church circle, if you have any kind of group that's already getting together, bring these all together. And now we can start organizing to not just serve one troop at a time, but actually bring resources together and deliver massive amounts of food, if you can sew, if you can knit, and we have many accounts of how women got together and actually, would be sending huge trunks of linens, of sheets, of clothing. Bear in mind that many of the soldiers, if they had just one uniform and something happens to them and now they're in a hospital, they don't have a change of clothes. It's not easy to get. So the women were taking care of all this, and bear in mind, this is before the internet. This is before a speedy little car can just zip down the road. This is before telephones. or you can just do this. So the massive amount of logistics that was taking place from women's perspective, I believe, is something that is kind of lost in history. Women created the women not just created, got behind the sanitary fairs that were operating and raised millions of dollars for the Union cause. And there was one in Pittsburgh that I believe raised over $300,000. Back in my little hometown of Milwaukee, there was late in the war, a women's relief group actually raised, I believe, over $100,000. And this money was used to buy the land on which a veterans hospital was built, one of the very first veterans hospitals. And I'm going to just mention 1865, one of the last bills that you signed, was to create homes for disabled Union soldiers. There had never previously been an infrastructure to care for Union veterans. We didn't have that kind of a war that needed this infrastructure. So I'm going to ask a question. Who is commonly known as the founder, or not commonly attributed to be, a founder of Veterans Administration? Anybody? $5 for the winning bid. Winning comment. Who was the president involved in being the founder of the Veterans Administration? Come on. President Lincoln. Thank you. Terry, you will get $5 on the way out here. And the other thing, I'm going to just flip away from coins for just a moment, if you're willing to chat a little bit. It is fairly well documented, I believe, what was in President Lincoln's real pockets on a very fateful day. And I believe you are going to share with us a couple notes about what was in Lincoln's pockets on that day. But please remember that coins, paper money, tokens, some of these things have a legacy that's beyond the numismatic value and has very much a humanities value that should be shared as well. So, President Lincoln.
Well, before I talk about what was in my pocket, I'd like to talk about these greenbacks, because everyone in Buchanan's cabinet and in his service, before I got to Washington, made sure that the Treasury was just about empty. And they made sure that what few ships we had in the United States Navy were sent thousands of miles away. So here I am, a newly elected president. I have a war in front of me that has to be financed, and I'm thinking, how are we going to do this? So Chase, Salmon P. Chase, who was always the smartest person in the room, who wanted to be the president, I made him the Secretary of the Treasury. And I said, Chase, how are we going to finance this war? I know the banks are more than willing to loan us some money at extraordinary interest. How are we going to do this? And Chase basically said, it's very simple, Mr. President. We'll just make our own money, and we did. And so yeah. And but, belief is a powerful thing, folks. If they give it to you and say, you can use this, and you believe that, I'm glad we didn't have to back it up. Now, as far as my pocket was concerned, I did have a wallet. The only piece of currency I had, or that was turned in, was a $5 Confederate note. Now, why did I have a $5 note? I wish I could tell you, but I never got home after that event. Why? Maybe it was a gift. I don't know. I also had a few other things in my pocket. I had a jackknife. I had two pairs of glasses, by the way, a straight pair of glasses and a pair of folding glasses. I had two pairs of gloves. I had several newspaper articles. Three of them were actually nice articles about me. The others were not. And I have something else here, though, that was not in my pocket that fateful night, but I do like to talk about this because it's the only thing that I can share with you that fits in with what you're doing here today. Now, as a boy growing up in my day, if you were a good son, you stayed with your family till you were 21 years old. If you made any money outside of the family, then that went to the family. And yet, when I was 18 years old, I had a little boat, and I used to take people across the Anderson River, and two fellows had missed a riverboat on the Ohio and said, can you take us out to the middle of this big river so we can catch the steamboat? I did. And they got on the ship, I put their trunks up, and I said, well, gentlemen, what about my pay? Well, guess what? They each flipped me a shiny $50. And my world changed that day. I said, here I was a boy of 18, and in less than a day, I had made $1. Now, I told this story to a gentleman that shares your interest, and I also told it to a bunch of young children there. And so a fella came to me and he said, now, Lincoln, how old were you when you got those $50? And I said, I was 18. And he said, when were you born? And I said, 1809. And he said, well, you need to carry this 1827 $50 in your pocket. And I've been carrying it ever since. So,
You had a talisman.
I had a talisman. I still carry it with me today. As a matter of fact, I will diverse from you for just a second.
Right.
What I found out about the, I know you people call it a hobby, but it's not a hobby. It is a passion. And I thought you were in the money business. But you've never been in the money business. You're in the history business. And by giving me this, and me being able to put it in the hand of a child, and have them read the date, and then have them take their finger and rub Lady Liberty there, who's very worn, and then hold their finger on her face and say, now ask yourself this question. Since 1827, how many fingers touched this? Where did it go and what did it buy? So you people are promoting history every day. Thank you.
Oh, I'll take it.
No, I'll take it myself.
I wasn't sure I was getting passed over. This is great.
Thank you. I would just like to make one comment, follow-up.
In terms of the way we approached, one little anecdote I read about Salmon Chase and Abe Lincoln. The John Dix story is true. He managed to squeeze a $5 million loan out of northern banks just before President Lincoln took office, which got the Treasury out of some hot water. But then the budget that was allocated by Buchanan for the following year, 1861, was about $50 million. The war itself, by the time it really got rolling, was costing $2 to $3 million a day. So it wasn't terribly easy for Chase to get that next loan. He went after $50 million from northern banks, and they didn't want huge interest rates. They balked. And according to what I read about Chase's negotiating skills, and I admire him for this, he said to the bankers assembled at his table, he said, gentlemen, if you don't lend me the money, I'm just going to start printing money until a breakfast cost $1,000. At which time they came back, reconvened, and lent him the money.
Gentlemen, we have our
That's
next.
the way I understand it. So I thank you very, very much for attending this particular program. Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. President.
And Rick, I'd like to say something, folks. I always thank you for being here, and I'm so excited that Rick and his lady decided to invite Sherman here. Now, this is I just met the General today, and this is the first coin show that he's ever walked into, and everyone has made him feel so welcome here, and I think he will be a great asset in the future to be able to tell a few stories that do tie into what we do here. So I just want to thank him very much for being here, and I want him to introduce himself. Can we do that? And tell me where you're from.
My name is Kris Gulvansen. I portray General William T. Sherman. I am from Seville, Ohio, which is about 20 miles west of Akron, and about 2 hours from here. And a while back, someone called the Sherman House in Lancaster, Ohio. They were looking for a Sherman because Rick was looking for a Sherman, and they gave him my name, and we went back and forth, and here I am. So thank you.